Block this!
Try harder!
Not yet!
Is that all you've got?
Not even close! It's clear, bring it down slow. Copy that, landing now.
The desert wind whispered across the tarmac as the sun painted the Nevada sky in shades of amber and gold. Captain Emma Rodriguez stood before her F-16 Fighting Falcon, running her pre-flight check with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Yet today felt different. Today, every eye at Nellis Air Force Base would be watching, judging, waiting for her to fail. At 32 years old, Emma had already logged more combat hours than most pilots twice her age. 3 deployments, 2 air medals for heroism, and a reputation for thinking outside the cockpit had brought her here to the Advanced Tactical Fighter Weapons School. But respect was something she still had to earn every single day. She was an outsider, a maverick in a world built on rigid structure and unwavering adherence to the book. From the observation tower, Colonel Brandon Hayes watched, his weathered hands gripping a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. 28 years of service had taught him everything about flying by the book, and he believed in that book with religious fervor. The manual existed for a reason. Rules kept people alive. And this Captain Rodriguez, with her unconventional maneuvers and creative interpretations of engagement protocols, represented everything that made him nervous about the new generation of pilots. He had reviewed her file 3 times, each reading leaving him more skeptical. Yes, her record was impressive on paper, but combat success built on improvisation was just luck waiting to run out. It was a dangerous gamble, one he wasn't willing to bet on. He saw her as a liability, a loose cannon who threatened the very discipline he had spent a lifetime upholding. Emma climbed into her cockpit, the familiar embrace of the fighter jet calming her racing thoughts. She knew what they said about her in the ready rooms and officer clubs. Too aggressive, too creative, too willing to bend the rules. But those same critics had never been in her position, never had to make split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance. She remembered a mission in the mountains of Afghanistan. A convoy was pinned down, facing certain destruction. Standard procedure offered no solution. So Emma broke the rules. She pulled a maneuver that no training manual would ever recommend, a high-risk, high-reward move that came from pure instinct. And it worked. She saved the entire convoy. It was a stark reminder of a truth that classroom instructors never quite grasped. Rules provided a foundation, but survival required adaptation. The battlefield didn't care about the textbook. The radio crackled to life in her helmet. Viper 3, this is Tower. You are cleared for takeoff. Proceed to training range Sierra 7. Can await further instructions. Emma acknowledged and began her taxi, the powerful engine responding to her touch like an extension of her own body. Behind her, 4 other aircraft prepared for departure. This evaluation would test every aspect of tactical flying, from basic maneuvers to complex engagement scenarios. But Emma knew the real test went deeper than technical skill. She was being evaluated on whether she could be trusted, whether her methods posed a risk to unit cohesion, whether a woman who refused to fly by someone else's playbook deserved a place among the elite. In his own fighter 3 positions back, Lieutenant James Cooper watched Emma's plane roll down the runway. He had heard the stories, of course, and most of them sounded exaggerated. In his experience, people who broke the rules usually did so because they lacked the discipline to follow them. His own path had been straightforward, traditional, and successful. He had earned his place through hard work and adherence to proven methods. Whatever happened today, he would be watching carefully. The integrity of the program depended on maintaining standards, not lowering them for someone who just wanted to do things her own way. The 5 aircraft lifted into the crystalline desert air, forming up with practiced precision. Emma felt the familiar rush of freedom that came with flight, the ground falling away, the vast sky opening up with infinite possibility. But she pushed those feelings aside and focused on the mission parameters scrolling across her heads-up display. The first phase would be standard, textbook maneuvers designed to assess basic competency. She could do those in her sleep. For the next hour, she was the model pilot. Her movements flawless, her execution perfect. She was a ghost in the machine, indistinguishable from the other pilots, perfectly in line with expectations. In the control room, Colonel Hayes leaned forward, studying the multiple screens showing telemetry from all 5 aircraft. Beside him sat Major Patricia Williams, the range safety officer, and Captain Robert Torres, the senior tactics instructor. "Let's see what she's got," Hayes muttered, more to himself than his colleagues. Major Williams glanced at him with an expression that suggested she had heard variations of this skepticism many times before. "Her scores from preliminary evaluations are exceptional, sir," Williams offered, her tone neutral. Hayes grunted non-committally. "Scores and combat are different things. We'll see how she handles pressure." The morning progressed through increasingly complex scenarios. Emma executed each task with mechanical efficiency, aware that she was being measured not just on performance, but on conformity. This was the game within the game. They wanted to see if she could follow instructions before they would ever trust her to make her own decisions. Fine. She would show them she could play by their rules when necessary. She would be the pilot they wanted her to be, just for a little while longer. But then the parameters changed. The real test began. "Viper 3, you have multiple bogies approaching from bearing 270, altitude Angels 20. You are weapons free for training engagement." Emma's pulse quickened as she scanned her radar. There they were. 4 simulated enemy aircraft on an intercept course. The scenario was a classic trap designed to test decision-making under fire. Standard doctrine called for a specific response pattern, a defensive split she had practiced countless times in the simulator. It was the safe, predictable, and expected answer. But as she analyzed the tactical situation, her mind working at 1,000 miles per second, she saw something else, something the scenario designers probably hadn't intended. There was a weakness in their formation, a flaw in their approach. She saw a better way, a faster, more aggressive maneuver that would achieve the objective with less risk to her flight and greater efficiency. It was a move straight from her own personal playbook, born from real-world combat. Her hand hesitated over the controls. Follow the expected pattern, or trust her instincts. Do what they wanted her to do, or do what she knew was right. The decision would define everything that came after. It was more than just a grade. It was a statement about who she was as a pilot. In that moment, Emma remembered why she had joined the Air Force in the first place. Not to be just another cog in the machine, not to execute someone else's playbook, but to make a difference, to push boundaries, to show that excellence came in many forms, not just the one prescribed in a manual. She was here to prove that innovation and instinct were not the enemies of discipline, but its most powerful allies. She made her choice. With a flick of her wrist, she broke formation, accelerating into a steep, gut-wrenching climb that took her far outside the prescribed engagement zone. In the control room, alarms immediately began to sound. Red lights flashed across the consoles. What is she doing? Hayes roared, his face a mask of fury. She's broken containment. She's off the script. Captain Torres stared at his screen, his eyes wide. Sir, her vector, it makes no sense. She's exposing herself completely. But Major Williams saw it. A flicker of understanding crossed her face. Wait, she said, her voice cutting through the panic. Look at her trajectory in relation to the bogies. She's not running. She's repositioning. High above the desert, Emma leveled off, placing the sun directly at her back. The enemy pilots would be blinded, their sensors struggling to lock on. She had just used the environment itself as a weapon. From this new, unexpected angle, she dove down on the simulated enemy formation like a hawk. They never saw her coming. One by one, Her targeting system chirped with lock-on tones. Fox 2, Fox 2, Fox 2, Fox 2. In less than 30 seconds, all 4 simulated targets were neutralized. The sky was clear. Silence fell over the comms channel, broken only by the sound of her own steady breathing. Back in the control room, the alarms had stopped. The room was deathly quiet. Hayes stared at the main screen, which now showed 4 green icons marked splashed and 1 lone blue icon, Viper 3, circling calmly above the engagement area. He was speechless. The maneuver was unorthodox, unsanctioned, and absolutely brilliant. It defied every rule in his book, yet its effectiveness was undeniable. Lieutenant Cooper, still flying in formation, had watched the entire engagement unfold on his radar. He saw Rodriguez break away, heard the alarm in his own cockpit, and prepared to follow the textbook procedure to cover her mistake. But there was no mistake. He watched as her icon single-handedly dismantled a superior force with a tactic he had never seen before. It wasn't reckless, it was masterful. For the first time, Cooper questioned everything he thought he knew about being a pilot. Maybe, just maybe, the rules weren't the only path to success. Emma's voice, calm and professional, came over the radio. "Tower, this is Viper 3. Range is clear." Awaiting further instructions, Colonel Hayes slowly sank back into his chair. He looked at the screen, then at the faces of his team, and finally out the window towards the endless blue sky where Emma Rodriguez was flying. A slow, grudging smile touched his lips. He picked up his microphone. "Viper 3, he said, his voice laced with a newfound respect. "Nice flying. Welcome to the program." Emma heard the words, and a genuine smile lit up her face, hidden behind her oxygen mask. She had done it. Not by conforming, but by being herself. She had shown them that the greatest weapon a pilot has isn't in the manual, but in the mind and heart of the one flying the jet. As she banked her F-16 towards home, she knew this was just the beginning. The sky was no longer the limit. It was her canvas. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content just like this. See you in the next one. Colonel Hayes shot forward in his chair, his coffee cup clattering onto the console. "What is she doing?" His voice cut through the control room like a razor. The tactical display showed Emma's fighter breaking away from the standard engagement pattern, diving low and fast toward a canyon system that bordered the training range. Major Williams quickly checked her instruments, ensuring all safety protocols remained active. "She's still within range boundaries, sir. Technically within parameters." Hayes glared at the screen. Technically isn't good enough when you're teaching the next generation of combat pilots. Emma pushed her fighter into the canyon, the rock walls blurring past her canopy at speeds that would make most pilots reconsider their career choices. She had studied these canyons during her preparation, memorizing every turn and elevation change. The simulated enemy aircraft followed, but their formation began to fracture as the narrow confines limited their maneuverability. This was the advantage she had calculated. In open sky, 4 against 1 meant certain defeat in any training scenario. But in terrain that rewarded individual skill over numerical superiority, the equation changed completely. Lieutenant James Cooper watched from his position above the canyon, torn between admiration and concern. What Emma was doing required extraordinary piloting skill, but it also violated every principle of tactical doctrine he had been taught. You never isolated yourself from your wingman. You never gave up the altitude advantage. You never engaged multiple opponents in an environment that limited your escape options. Yet somehow, Emma was making it work. Her fighter danced through the canyon like a falcon hunting prey, using the terrain to break up the enemy formation and engage them one at a time. In the control room, Captain Torres leaned closer to his displays, his tactical mind analyzing what he was witnessing. "Sir, She's using the canyon walls to mask her radar signature. Each enemy aircraft loses lock as they enter the narrow sections. She's picking them off during those gaps. Hayes remained rigid, his jaw clenched. It's reckless. One mistake at that speed, and she's a smoking hole in the ground. But Major Williams had pulled up Emma's personnel file on a secondary screen. Sir, she used a similar tactic in Afghanistan. Saved a transport convoy from 3 hostile aircraft by drawing them into mountain terrain. All 3 hostiles neutralized, 0 friendly casualties. Emma pulled hard on her stick, the G-forces crushing her into her seat as she whipped around a rock formation and came up behind the 3rd simulated enemy. Her training weapon systems acquired lock, and she pressed the engagement button. Splash 3, she reported calmly, her breathing controlled despite the physical strain. 1 enemy remained, and she could see him on her radar trying to gain altitude to escape the canyon. She throttled up, racing after him as the canyon walls began to widen. This was the critical moment. In seconds, they would be back in open sky, where her altitude disadvantage could prove fatal. Lieutenant Cooper made a decision that surprised even himself. He broke from his observation position and dove toward the canyon exit, positioning himself above and behind where the last enemy aircraft would emerge. It was not part of the training scenario, but something about Emma's performance had shifted his perspective. If she was going to commit to this unorthodox approach, the least he could do was provide the cover she would need. As the enemy fighter burst from the canyon, Cooper was waiting. Splash 4, he called over the radio. Viper 3, you're clear. There was a long silence on the radio frequency. Emma pulled her fighter up and out of the canyon, leveling off beside Cooper. Through their canopies, they made brief eye contact. His expression was unreadable, but the fact that he had backed her play spoke volumes. Viper 5, this is Viper 3. Thanks for the assist. Cooper's response came after a pause. Just following the tactical situation as it developed, 3. Colonel Hayes stood motionless in the control room, staring at the replay of the engagement on his screens. Every regulation-following instinct in his body wanted to ground Emma immediately and write a report that would end her career at the weapons school. But another part of him, the part that had survived 3 wars and countless combat missions, recognized something undeniable. What he had just witnessed was not recklessness. It was mastery. Dangerous, unconventional, but undeniably effective mastery. Bring them all back to base, Hayes said finally, his voice quiet. I want Captain Rodriguez in my office the moment she lands. Major Williams exchanged a glance with Captain Torres. They both knew that tone. Someone was about to receive either a career-ending reprimand or a lesson they would never forget. Possibly both. Emma landed her aircraft 30 minutes later, her hands steady as she completed the post-flight procedures. She had known the risks when she made her choice in the canyon, but she had also known that playing it safe would never change the perception that her methods were unreliable. Sometimes you had to show people what was possible before they could believe it. She climbed down from her fighter to find Lieutenant Cooper waiting on the tarmac. That was either brilliant or insane, Cooper said, his expression still conflicted. I haven't decided which. Emma pulled off her helmet, her hair damp with sweat. Maybe it was both. Thanks for having my back up there. Cooper shook his head slowly. I'm still not sure I agree with what you did, but I couldn't just watch you hang out there alone. Before Emma could respond, a staff sergeant approached. Captain Rodriguez, Colonel Hayes wants to see you immediately. The walk to Hayes's office felt longer than any combat mission Emma had ever flown. She passed other pilots and instructors, their faces revealing they had already heard what happened. Some looked impressed, others concerned, most simply curious about what would happen next. She reached the colonel's door and knocked twice, crisp and military. "Enter," came the gruff response. Colonel Hayes sat behind his desk, Emma's personnel file open in front of him. He did not invite her to sit. For a long moment, he simply studied her, his eyes revealing decades of experience evaluating pilots and making decisions that affected lives and careers. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Emma stand even straighter. "Captain Rodriguez, in my 28 years of service, I have seen exactly 3 pilots attempt what you did today. 2 of them died in training accidents. The third became one of the finest tactical aviators this country has ever produced." Emma remained silent, waiting. Hayes stood and walked to his window, looking out over the airfield. "I called you here to decide which category you belong in. Whether you're a dangerous maverick who will get people killed or something else entirely." He turned to face her directly. "Here's what's going to happen next. Tomorrow morning, 0600, you're going to face a scenario that makes today look like a Sunday flight around the pattern. I'm going to throw everything at you that I can legally authorize. And you're going to show me whether your methods can work when everything goes wrong at once." Emma felt her heart pounding, but kept her voice steady. "Yes, sir. I'll be ready." Hayes's expression remained unreadable. "Dismissed. And Captain, get some rest. You're going to need it." As Emma left the office, she passed Major Williams in the hallway. The Major gave her a slight nod, almost imperceptible. It was not quite approval, but it was not condemnation either. Emma had 20 hours to prepare for whatever Hayes was planning. 20 hours to prove that breaking the mold was not the same as breaking faith with everything the military stood for. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Nellis Air Force Base like a blanket, broken only by the runway lights stretching into the distance. Emma had barely slept, spending most of the night reviewing tactics and mentally preparing for whatever Colonel Hayes had planned. She arrived at the briefing room at 5:30, surprised to find it already occupied. Lieutenant Cooper sat in the front row, along with 4 other pilots she recognized from advanced training units. Major Williams stood at the front, organizing materials on a large display screen. "Captain Rodriguez, glad you could join us early," Williams said, her tone professional, but carrying a hint of something else. Respect, perhaps. "Colonel Hayes will be here shortly to brief the full scenario. But I wanted you to know that what happens today goes beyond your personal evaluation. These pilots have volunteered to participate because they want to see what's possible when we challenge our assumptions." Emma took a seat, feeling the weight of those words. This was not just about proving herself anymore. It had become something larger. Colonel Hayes entered precisely at 600 hours, carrying a tablet and wearing an expression that revealed nothing. "Good morning. What you're about to experience is a scenario based on actual events from a classified operation 3 years ago. I've modified it for training purposes, but the core tactical problem remains unchanged. In the real event, we lost 2 aircraft and barely accomplished the mission objective. Captain Rodriguez, your task is to find a better solution using whatever methods you deem appropriate. The other pilots will play opposing forces and environmental challenges. You'll have 15 minutes to plan, then we launch." The scenario unfolded on the display screen, and Emma felt her stomach tighten. It was a nightmare situation involving hostile surface-to-air missile sites, enemy fighters, and a critical time-sensitive target deep in defended territory. The standard approach had worked in the real operation, but at a terrible cost. Hayes was asking her to find a way that would have saved those 2 pilots while still completing the mission. It was the kind of problem that kept tactical planners awake at night, the kind where every solution seemed to require an impossible choice. Emma stood and walked to the display, her mind already breaking down the elements into manageable pieces. The other pilots watched silently as she traced flight paths with her finger calculating angles and timing. Then she turned to face them, and in that moment something shifted in the room. These were not skeptics waiting for her to fail. They were professionals who wanted answers to impossible questions, who were tired of accepting that some missions simply required sacrifice. The standard doctrine fails here because it treats the enemy defenses as static obstacles. Emma began, her voice growing confident. But they're not obstacles. They're part of a system, and systems have rhythms, patterns, vulnerabilities. If we approach this not as a penetration mission, but as a disruption operation, we change the entire equation. She outlined her plan, using terrain masking, timing coordination, and a series of feints that would overload the enemy's decision-making process. It was aggressive, complex, and required split-second coordination. It was also brilliant. Cooper spoke up from his seat. That approach requires the lead aircraft to expose itself during the initial feint. High risk, Emma nodded. Yes, which is why the lead aircraft needs to be flown by someone willing to trust their instincts over their instruments for about 40 seconds. The radar will scream warnings. Training will say pull out, but the physics work if you hold the line. Hayes had remained silent throughout, but now he stepped forward. Captain Torres, load the scenario. Full simulation parameters. Captain Rodriguez, you have one shot at this. The next 2 hours tested everything Emma had learned in her career. The simulation pushed her to the absolute edge of her abilities and beyond. Twice she nearly failed, saved only by the kind of instantaneous decision-making that cannot be taught in classrooms. But she also discovered something unexpected. When Cooper and the other pilots understood her tactical vision, they adapted their own flying to support it. The rigid adherence to individual doctrine gave way to fluid teamwork built on trust rather than procedure. When the simulation ended with all aircraft surviving and the mission accomplished, the briefing room fell silent. Emma climbed out of the simulator, her flight suit soaked with sweat, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Hayes stood waiting, and for the first time since she had met him, his expression had softened. Captain Rodriguez, I owe you an apology, he said clearly, loudly enough for everyone to hear. I spent 3 years believing we lost those pilots because of bad luck and enemy capability. But we lost them because I was too rigid to imagine a different approach. Major Williams stepped forward with a tablet. Sir, if I may, I've been running Captain Rodriguez's tactical profile through our analysis systems. Her methods show a consistent pattern. Higher initial risk in exchange for dramatically reduced overall exposure time. The mathematics support her approach in 73% of scenarios we tested. Hayes took the tablet, studying the data. When he looked up, there was something new in his eyes. Not just acceptance, but genuine curiosity. Lieutenant Cooper approached Emma, extending his hand. I was wrong about you. What you do is not about breaking rules. It's about understanding why the rules exist well enough to know when a better solution is possible. Emma shook his hand, feeling the sincerity in his grip. I couldn't have done it without you backing the play. That matters more than you know. Around them, the other pilots began gathering, asking questions, wanting to understand the principles behind her tactics. This was what Emma had hoped for, but never quite believed would happen. Not blind acceptance of her methods, but thoughtful engagement with ideas that challenged comfortable assumptions. Colonel Hayes called for attention. Everyone, listen up. What happened here today represents something important for our program and our military. Captain Rodriguez has shown us that innovation and discipline are not opposites. They're partners. Effective innovation requires deep understanding of fundamentals. And true discipline means being brave enough to adapt when the situation demands it. He turned to Emma directly. Captain, I'm recommending you for a position as a tactics instructor here at the weapons school. We need people who can teach our pilots not just how to follow the playbook, but how to write new chapters when the old ones no longer serve. Emma felt emotion rising in her chest, but kept her composure. Sir, I'd be honored, but only if the curriculum makes room for different approaches, different voices. What works for me might not work for everyone, and that's okay. The goal should be helping each pilot find their own excellence, not creating copies of any single model. Hayes actually smiled, a rare sight according to base legend. Agreed. In fact, that's exactly the kind of thinking we need. As the briefing room emptied and pilots headed to the flight line for regular training operations, Emma stood alone for a moment, looking at the simulator that had just changed her career trajectory. She thought about all the people who had doubted her, all the time she had questioned whether fighting for recognition was worth the constant battle. Now she knew the answer. It was worth it not because she needed validation, but because every barrier broken made the path easier for those who would follow. Major Williams approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this. Emma accepted gratefully. Thank you, ma'am. For everything. I know you advocated for me, even when it wasn't easy. Williams took a sip of her own coffee. I've been in this military for 19 years, Emma. I've seen brilliance dismissed because it came in an unexpected package. I've watched talented people leave because they got tired of proving themselves over and over. What you did today reminded me why I stay. Because eventually, excellence finds a way to shine through if we create even the smallest opening. They walked together toward the flight line, where morning sun now bathed the aircraft in golden light. In the distance, Cooper was briefing his flight crew, and Emma noticed he was using hand gestures that mimicked some of the maneuvers from her simulation. The ideas were already spreading, evolving, becoming part of the collective knowledge. Emma realized something profound in that moment. She had not won by defeating Colonel Hayes or proving the doubters wrong. She had won by showing that there was room for everyone to grow, to learn, to become better versions of themselves. Hayes had learned that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. Cooper had learned that supporting others' success did not diminish his own. And she had learned that breaking barriers was not about tearing down what came before, but about building bridges to what could come next. That evening, as Emma completed her paperwork for the instructor position, she received a message from Hayes. It contained a single line and an attachment. The line read, "This is the after-action report from the real mission 3 years ago. The attachment is your simulation data. I'm sending both to Tactical Development Command with a recommendation that we revise our doctrine. Your approach could save lives." Emma opened the attachments and began reading, already thinking about how to translate these lessons into teaching methods that would resonate with different learning styles. Outside her window, aircraft took off into the darkening sky, their engines roaring with power and purpose. Each one carried a pilot with unique talents, unique perspectives, unique potential. Emma's journey had taught her that the military's greatest strength was not uniformity, but the courage to harness diversity of thought in service of common purpose. She was not just a pilot anymore, or an instructor, or a barrier breaker. She was a reminder that excellence has many faces, and the future belongs to those brave enough to recognize brilliance wherever it appears. The sky had no limits, and neither did the human spirit when given the freedom to soar.